I stood at the front of TechFlow Solutions' mahogany conference table, my quarterly analytics presentation half finished on the wall screen behind me, when our new Chief Technology Officer, Diana Sterling, cut through my sentence like a blade. The 12 board members sat frozen as she leaned forward in her leather chair and delivered words that would change everything. "You're fired. Security will escort you out." The room temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. Without breaking eye contact, I set my company badge on the polished surface and replied with a calmness that surprised even me. "Check your emails. The board will meet in 4 hours." As I walked toward the glass doors, whispers erupted behind me like wildfire, but Diana's confident smirk told me she had no idea what storm was about to break. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. 3 months of meticulous planning had led to this moment. Diana Sterling thought she'd just eliminated her biggest threat, but she'd actually triggered the final phase of her own downfall. It started back in June when I first noticed the irregularities. As senior data analyst at TechFlow, I lived in spreadsheets and budget reports. Numbers told stories, and the story these numbers told made my blood run cold. Budget allocations were appearing for vendors I'd never heard of, purchase orders for software licenses that never materialized, consulting fees paid to companies that seemed to exist only on paper. The amounts weren't massive enough to trigger automatic audits, but they were consistent. 50,000 here, 75,000 there, always just under the threshold that would require additional board approval. Someone was bleeding the company dry drop by careful drop. Initially, I thought it might be accounting errors. I brought my concerns to Tom Bradley, our chief financial officer, who'd become something of a mentor to me over my 4 years at TechFlow. Tom had been with the company for 15 years and was planning his retirement for the end of the year. He was a straight shooter with silver hair and laugh lines earned from 3 decades in corporate finance. "Vera," he said, adjusting his reading glasses as he studied my printouts in his corner office. "These patterns you're seeing worry me too, but here's what really concerns me. These vendors, they all started appearing right around the time the board announced they'd hired Diana Sterling as our new CTO. That's when the pieces started falling into place. Diana hadn't officially started yet, but as incoming CTO, she'd been granted access to certain systems during her transition period. She was supposed to be reviewing current technology infrastructure and planning upgrades. Instead, she was setting up her own personal ATM. Tom and I spent the next 2 weeks diving deeper. We discovered that Diana had worked at 4 other tech companies over the past decade. At each one, she'd stayed roughly 18 months before moving on to bigger opportunities. Nothing illegal about changing jobs, except when I started researching those companies, I found interesting patterns. Each had experienced mysterious budget overruns during Diana's tenure. Each had struggled with vendor management issues, and each had seen valuable employees leave unexpectedly, usually mid-project. "She's done this before," I told Tom as we sat in his office after hours surrounded by financial records and laptop screens. "She comes in, sets up her network, starts skimming money, and when things get too hot, or she's taken enough, she moves on to the next company." Tom rubbed his temples. "Do you realize what you're suggesting? This woman has sterling recommendations from some of the biggest names in tech. Her resume is impeccable." "That's exactly how she gets away with it," I replied. "Who's going to accuse someone with her credentials? And by the time anyone notices the missing money, she's already gone, and explaining it becomes the next person's problem." But Diana had made one crucial mistake. She'd started her scheme before officially taking the position, which meant she was already breaking federal wire fraud laws. And she'd underestimated me. I spent the next month documenting everything. I photographed documents when I stayed late at the office. I traced digital footprints through our financial systems. I even recorded phone conversations when Diana called to coordinate her transition activities conversations, where she gave directions about vendor payments that I now knew were fraudulent. The breakthrough came when I discovered Diana wasn't working alone. She had accomplices inside TechFlow who were helping her. Jake Harrison, our vice president of operations, had been approving purchase orders without proper verification. Linda Walsh, head of procurement, had been fast-tracking vendor applications for companies that existed only on paper. Most shocking of all, Robert Kane, one of our most respected board members, had been using his influence to push through budget amendments that created the very funding pools Diana was stealing from. That's when I knew I needed help beyond what Tom and I could provide. This wasn't just corporate embezzlement anymore. This was organized crime. I contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit 6 weeks ago. Agent Sarah Murphy, a sharp-eyed investigator in her 40s who specialized in corporate fraud cases, took my call seriously from the moment I mentioned the interstate nature of Diana's previous positions. What you're describing sounds like a sophisticated racketeering operation. Agent Murphy told me during our first meeting at a coffee shop downtown. If she's been running the same scheme at multiple companies across state lines, we're looking at federal charges that could put her away for decades. The FBI had me continue my normal work while wearing a wire to capture conversations with Diana and her accomplices. They installed monitoring software on my work computer to track any attempts at tampering with financial records. Most importantly, they helped me understand that Diana would eventually need to eliminate anyone who might expose her operation. She's going to come after you, Agent Murphy warned. People running cons like this don't leave loose ends. When she realizes you're a threat, she'll try to discredit you first. If that doesn't work, she'll escalate. The escalation came sooner than any of us expected. 2 weeks ago, I started noticing that files I'd saved on the company server were disappearing. Database queries I'd run were being deleted from the system logs. Someone was trying to erase the digital trail I'd been following. Then I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. Diana had been accessing my computer remotely, monitoring my work, reading my emails. She knew I was investigating her. Worse, she'd been planting false evidence in my user account, creating fake transactions that made it look like I was the one embezzling money. She was setting me up to take the fall for her crimes. That's when Agent Murphy and I developed the final phase of our plan. We needed Diana to make a move that would be so blatantly illegal, so obviously an abuse of power, that it would serve as irrefutable evidence of her criminal intent. We needed her to overplay her hand. The quarterly board meeting was perfect. Diana would be there in her official capacity for the first time. She'd be confident, feeling untouchable with her new position and authority. And she'd have the opportunity to eliminate her biggest threat in front of witnesses. All I had to do was give her the rope to hang herself with. As I walked out of TechFlow's corporate headquarters, for what might be the last time as an employee, I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to Agent Murphy. Phase 3 complete. The fish took the bait. Diana Sterling thought she'd just fired me. What she'd actually done was commit a federal crime in front of 12 witnesses while simultaneously providing the FBI with everything they needed to destroy her entire operation. In 4 hours, she was going to learn the difference between confidence and arrogance. The coffee shop where I met Agent Murphy 2 hours after my public humiliation was the same one where we'd first discussed the case 6 weeks earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Murphy sat across from me in the corner booth, a thick manila folder spread between our coffee cups, her expression grim as she reviewed the latest developments. "Diana's moving faster than we anticipated," Murphy said, sliding photographs across the table. "These were taken at her apartment complex last night. She's destroying evidence and she's not being careful about it." The photos showed Diana carrying boxes to a dumpster behind her luxury high-rise apartment building. Even in the grainy surveillance images, I could see the distinctive blue folders that TechFlow used for financial documents. "That's not the worst part," Murphy continued. "Our wiretaps picked up some concerning conversations over the past week. She's been in contact with Jake Harrison, Linda Walsh, and Robert Kane almost daily. They're coordinating their stories, but more than that, they're planning to pin everything on you." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Murphy opened another section of the folder, revealing bank statements and financial records I'd never seen before. "They've been building a case against you for 2 weeks. Fake email trails showing you authorizing fraudulent payments, forged purchase orders with your digital signature. They've even created false vendor contracts that list you as the primary contact." I stared at the documents, my hands trembling slightly. The level of sophistication in the forgeries was terrifying. If I hadn't known these were fake, I might have believed them myself. "But we have recordings of Diana admitting to the fraud," I protested. "We have evidence of her accessing systems before she was officially employed." "We do," Murphy agreed. "But juries love simple stories, and the story they're building is very simple. Young employee gets access to financial systems, gets greedy, starts stealing money. And when she's about to get caught, she tries to frame her new boss. They're painting you as a disgruntled worker who couldn't handle having a female supervisor." The sexist angle made my anger flare. That's ridiculous. I was excited about having Diana as CTO when she was first hired. I thought having more women in leadership would be great for the company culture. I know that and you know that. But they're going to argue that you felt threatened by someone more successful and decided to destroy her rather than accept her authority. They've even found a few emails you sent to colleagues expressing frustration with some of Diana's preliminary decisions. I remembered those emails. I'd been venting to friends about some of Diana's technology choices that I thought were inefficient. Normal workplace griping that every employee does. But in the hands of skilled lawyers, I could see how they might be twisted into evidence of hostility. Murphy pulled out another set of documents. Here's where it gets really concerning. We've discovered that Diana's operation is much larger than we initially thought. She's not just working with accomplices at TechFlow. She's got connections to a network of corrupt executives, fake vendors, and money launderers that spans multiple states. The new information was staggering. Diana had been part of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over a decade. The scheme worked like this: corrupt executives would create fake vendors and shell companies. Money would be funneled through these entities using fraudulent contracts for services never rendered. The stolen funds would be laundered through legitimate-looking business transactions before being distributed to the network members. TechFlow wasn't Diana's first target. It wasn't even her biggest. Over the past 10 years, this network had stolen an estimated $12 million from various companies across the technology sector. But here's the thing that should terrify you, Murphy said, her voice dropping to a whisper. In every previous case, there was always someone who got too close to the truth. Someone who asked too many questions or saw too many patterns. What happened to them? 3 cases we know of. Rachel Martinez at CloudSync Technologies in Denver died in a car accident 2 weeks after she filed a complaint with HR about irregular vendor payments. David Kim at Dataflow Systems in Seattle was found dead in his apartment from an apparent overdose despite having no history of drug use. Jennifer Walsh at Process Pro in Phoenix disappeared entirely. Her car was found in long-term airport parking, but she never boarded a flight. The blood drained from my face. You think Diana had them killed? I think this network has shown a willingness to eliminate threats by any means necessary. And Vera, you're not just a threat now, you're an existential danger to their entire operation. Murphy closed the folder and leaned forward. That's why we need to accelerate our timeline. We can't wait for them to make the first move against you personally. We need to take down the whole network before they realize how much evidence we've gathered. She pulled out her phone and showed me a text message she'd received 30 minutes earlier. Package ready for delivery, confirm address and timeline. This came from a number we've been monitoring in Diana's network, Murphy explained. We think package ready for delivery is code for a hit being arranged. The address they're asking about is yours. My apartment address. They were planning to kill me. We're moving you into protective custody tonight, Murphy continued. We've got a safe house set up, and we're going to coordinate with local law enforcement to make it look like you fled the state. Meanwhile, we'll be monitoring all of Diana's communications and preparing to move on the entire network. But what about the board meeting? I asked. I told them to check their emails and meet in 4 hours. If I disappear now, won't that prove I'm guilty of something? Murphy smiled for the first time since I'd sat down. That's the beautiful part of your plan. You're not going to disappear. You're going to show up to that board meeting with the full weight of the federal government behind you. Because in 4 hours, we're not just going to expose Diana's embezzlement at TechFlow. She pulled out one final document from the folder. It was a federal warrant signed by a judge that morning. In 4 hours, we're going to take down the entire criminal network she's been running for the past decade. Every fake company, every corrupt executive, every accomplice across 3 states. Diana Sterling is about to learn that firing you was the biggest mistake she ever made. As I read through the warrant, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The investigation had uncovered financial records showing that Diana's network had been targeting TechFlow specifically because of my grandfather's legacy. My grandfather, Frank Morrison, had founded TechFlow Solutions in 1967. When he died 5 years ago, he left his shares in the company to a trust fund that would transfer to me on my 28th birthday. My birthday had been last month, which meant I now owned 15% of TechFlow Solutions. Diana hadn't just been stealing from the company I worked for. She'd been stealing from a company I partially owned. And as a major shareholder, I had rights that went far beyond those of a regular employee. Did you know about the inheritance? Murphy asked, watching my face as I processed the information. I knew about the trust fund, I admitted. but I never really thought about what it meant in practical terms. I've just been so focused on my career and building my own path that I didn't want to rely on family connections. Well, those family connections are about to save your life and destroy Diana's operation. Because as a 15% shareholder, you have the legal right to call emergency board meetings, demand financial audits, and access all company records. Everything we need to prove Diana's guilt is in those corporate files. Murphy stood up and gathered her papers. Go home, pack a bag, and meet us at the address I'm going to text you. In 3 hours, we'll drive you to that board meeting, and you'll walk in there as both the whistleblower who exposed the fraud and the major shareholder demanding justice. As I left the coffee shop, my mind was racing with the implications of what I'd just learned. Diana had chosen the wrong target. She thought she was dealing with a low-level employee who could be easily discredited or eliminated. Instead, she'd picked a fight with someone who had the resources, the legal standing, and now the federal backing to destroy her completely. The next 4 hours were going to change everything. I never made it home that afternoon. As I pulled into my apartment complex, Agent Murphy called with urgency in her voice that made my blood freeze. Don't go to your apartment. Drive straight to the Starbucks on 5th and Main. We've got a situation. 20 minutes later, I sat in Murphy's unmarked sedan in the coffee shop parking lot, watching my apartment building through binoculars. What I saw made my hands shake. 2 men in dark clothing were systematically searching my apartment. Through my third-floor window, I could see them rifling through my desk, pulling books off shelves and photographing documents. One of them was using some kind of electronic device to scan my walls, probably looking for hidden surveillance equipment or storage. They've been there for 40 minutes, Murphy said. Professional job. They disabled the building's security cameras before going in, picked your lock without triggering any alarms, and they're being careful not to destroy anything. They want this to look like a normal break-in, not a targeted search. How did you know to warn me? Murphy pointed to a third man sitting in a black SUV in the visitor parking area. Our surveillance team spotted the vehicle following you from the coffee shop where we met. We've been tracking their communications, and 20 minutes ago, we intercepted a message saying subject en route to residence team in position. The reality of how close I'd come to walking into a trap hit me like a physical blow. What would have happened if I'd gone up to my apartment? Best case scenario, they would have confronted you and tried to scare you into keeping quiet about Diana's operation. Worst case scenario, you would have had an unfortunate accident. These people don't leave witnesses. As we watched, one of the men emerged from my building and approached the SUV. Even from a distance, I could see him shaking his head and gesturing in frustration. They hadn't found what they were looking for. What were they trying to find? I asked. Probably the evidence you've been collecting. Financial documents, recordings, anything that could prove Diana's guilt. They know you've been investigating, but they don't know how much you've discovered or where you're keeping the proof. Murphy's radio crackled with a coded message. She listened for a moment, then turned to me with the expression I couldn't quite read. There's something else. The man in the SUV isn't just surveillance. Our tech team ran his license plates and facial recognition. His name is Carlos Mendez, and he's got a record for assault extortion and suspected involvement in at least 2 unsolved homicides in the past 3 years. My stomach dropped. They sent a killer after me. That's what we thought initially. But here's where it gets interesting. Murphy pulled out her tablet and showed me a series of surveillance photos. Carlos Mendez has been working undercover for the FBI for the past 18 months. He's not there to hurt you, Vera. He's there to protect you. The revelation hit me like a thunderbolt. The FBI had infiltrated Diana's network so deeply that when she tried to arrange my murder, she'd unknowingly hired a federal agent. 6 months ago, we got a tip about a contract-killing operation that was being used by white-collar criminals to eliminate witnesses, Murphy explained. We managed to flip one of their operatives and insert Agent Mendez into the organization. When Diana's people reached out yesterday, looking for someone to handle a problem employee, Mendez took the job. So Diana thinks she has hired someone to kill me, but she's actually hired an FBI agent to protect me. Exactly. And every communication she's had about arranging your death has been recorded. We've got her on conspiracy to commit murder on top of the fraud and racketeering charges. Murphy's radio crackled again. This time, her expression grew even more serious as she listened to the message. We've got a bigger problem. Diana isn't just targeting you anymore. Our wiretaps picked up a conversation from an hour ago. She's decided that your entire family represents a threat to her operation. She showed me transcripts of phone calls that made my blood run cold. Diana had discovered that my parents, Helen and Frank Morrison, lived in Columbus, Ohio. She'd learned that my younger sister, Emma, was a senior at Ohio State University, and she'd decided that the best way to ensure my silence was to threaten the people I cared about most. "She's sending people to Ohio tonight," Murphy continued. "2 teams, one for your parents, one for your sister. The plan is to kidnap them and use them as leverage to force you to confess to the embezzlement charges and agree to serve prison time." The thought of my family being hurt because of my investigation made me feel physically sick. My parents were in their 60s, retired school teachers who still lived in the same house where I'd grown up. Emma was just 22 years old, focused on her psychology degree, and completely unaware of the corporate drama I'd been dealing with. "What can we do?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Murphy's expression shifted from concern to determination. "We're going to turn this around on her. Diana thinks she's about to gain leverage over you by threatening your family. What she doesn't know is that we've been monitoring her communications for weeks. We knew this was a possibility, and we've already taken steps to protect everyone you care about." She pulled out her phone and showed me a text message sent 2 hours earlier. "Packages secured and relocated to safe locations. Standing by for further instructions." "Your parents are fine," Murphy assured me. "We contacted them this morning, explained the situation, and moved them to a federal safe house in Columbus. Your sister is also safe. She's been staying with federal marshals since yesterday, though she thinks it's just a temporary relocation due to a gas leak in her dorm building." Relief flooded through me, but Murphy held up a hand before I could celebrate. "Here's where we're going to get creative. Diana's people are going to arrive at both locations tonight expecting to find your family members. Instead, they're going to find FBI agents waiting for them. We'll arrest the kidnapping teams, which will give us even more evidence against Diana's network." "But won't Diana realize she's been set up when her people get arrested?" Murphy smiled grimly. "That's exactly what we want. When Diana finds out that her kidnapping plan failed, she's going to panic. Panicked criminals make mistakes, and we're going to be ready to catch every mistake she makes." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Diana had escalated from financial fraud to attempted murder to kidnapping. Each crime carried increasingly severe penalties, and each attempt had been thwarted by FBI surveillance and preparation. By tomorrow morning, she would be facing federal charges that could result in life in prison. "But first," Murphy said, checking her watch, "we need to get you ready for that board meeting, because in 90 minutes you're going to walk into TechFlow's conference room with the full backing of the federal government and 15% ownership of the company. Diana Sterling is about to learn that firing you was the beginning of the end for her entire criminal empire." As we drove toward the federal building where I would prepare for the confrontation of my life, I thought about how much had changed since that morning. 12 hours ago, I'd been a data analyst hoping to expose some embezzlement. Now I was a federal witness, a major shareholder, and apparently the target of a sophisticated criminal organization. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Diana had made a fatal error when she escalated from financial crimes to violence. She'd given the FBI everything they needed to destroy not just her, but the entire network she'd been part of for over a decade. In 90 minutes, justice was coming for Diana Sterling, and I was going to be the one to deliver it. The federal building conference room felt like a command center for a military operation. Multiple agents worked at laptops monitoring communications intercepts and coordinating with field teams in Ohio. Agent Murphy stood at the front of the room briefing me on the final phase of our plan when her phone rang with the call we'd been expecting. Diana's voice filled the room through the speakerphone, cold and calculating. "I believe you have something that belongs to me, Miss Morrison. Or should I say, Miss Vera Morrison, granddaughter of Frank Morrison, secret 15% owner of my company." I looked at Murphy, who nodded encouragingly. This was exactly what we'd planned for. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Of course you do," Diana continued. "You've been investigating me for months. You've collected evidence about financial transactions that you clearly don't understand. And now you've involved federal agents in corporate matters that are none of their concern." The fact that she knew about FBI involvement confirmed what we'd suspected. Diana had sources inside law enforcement or corporate security that had been feeding her information about our investigation. "But I'm a reasonable woman," Diana went on. "I'm willing to resolve this situation in a way that protects everyone involved, including your family." That's when she played what she thought was her trump card. The video call came through on a tablet that one of her accomplices had sent to my known email address. The image showed a young woman tied to a chair in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. The woman had Emma's height and build, her dark brown hair falling over her face as she struggled against rope bindings. "Emma," I gasped, playing my part perfectly. "Your sister is perfectly safe for now," Diana said with satisfaction in her voice. "But her continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to go to that board meeting in 45 minutes, and you're going to confess to embezzling money from TechFlow Solutions. You're going to provide a detailed explanation of how you created fake vendors and authorized fraudulent payments. You're going to apologize to me personally for trying to frame me for your crimes." The audacity was breathtaking. Even while committing federal kidnapping, Diana was still trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. "And if I refuse, then your sister's disappearance will become permanent. And trust me, Miss Morrison, when someone disappears in my network, they're never found." Murphy held up a sign that read, "Keep her talking." The longer Diana stayed on the phone, the more evidence we gathered about her criminal operation. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" I asked. "How do I know you'll release Emma if I confess?" Diana's laugh was chilling. "You don't, but you know what will happen if you don't cooperate. Choose wisely, Miss Morrison. You have 30 minutes to decide whether your sister's life is worth more than your pride." The video call ended, but the phone line stayed open. Diana wanted to maintain contact to ensure I followed her instructions. Murphy walked over to me with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Perfect," she whispered. "We got everything we needed." "What do you mean?" I whispered back. Murphy pointed to a bank of monitors where other agents were analyzing the video call in real time. First, the kidnapping threat was made across state lines using electronic communications, which makes it a federal crime. Second, Diana just confessed to being part of a network that makes people disappear permanently, which gives us evidence for multiple homicide investigations. Third, and most importantly, that's not your sister in the video. I stared at her in confusion. "What?" "That's FBI agent Jessica Chen," Murphy explained quietly. "She's been undercover in Diana's operation for 2 months. The warehouse is actually a controlled location that we've been using to gather intelligence on the kidnapping side of their business." The revelation was staggering. Not only was Emma safe, but the FBI had been so far ahead of Diana's planning that they'd infiltrated even her backup criminal operations. "Agent Chen has been wearing a wire and a tracking device throughout this entire operation," Murphy continued. "Every word Diana's people have said, every plan they've discussed, every threat they've made has been recorded. The warehouse location has allowed us to identify 12 other members of the criminal network who we didn't even know existed. But Diana thinks she's actually kidnapped Emma." "Absolutely, and in about 10 minutes her confidence is going to be completely shattered." Murphy checked her watch and then spoke into her radio. "Alpha Team, initiate Phase 4. On the monitors around the room, we watched as FBI agents surrounded the warehouse where Agent Chen was being held. The coordinated arrest happened so quickly that Diana's accomplices didn't have time to react. Within minutes, the entire kidnapping team was in federal custody. My phone rang again. Diana's voice was noticeably less confident this time. "There's been a complication with your sister's situation," she said carefully. "But that doesn't change the fundamental arrangement we discussed. You still need to confess at the board meeting." "What kind of complication?" I asked, still playing my role. "That's not your concern. What matters is that you understand I have resources you can't imagine. If you try to double-cross me, the consequences will be more severe than anything you can comprehend." Murphy was grinning broadly now. She held up her tablet, showing me a text message from Agent Chen. "Warehouse team arrested. Subject in custody. Secondary location identified with additional evidence." "I understand," I told Diana. "I'll do what you want. Just don't hurt anyone else." "Smart choice. I'll see you at the board meeting, Miss Morrison. And remember, I'll be watching to make sure you follow through on your commitments." After Diana ended the call, Murphy turned to address the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just completed the largest white-collar crime bust in FBI history for this region. Diana Sterling's network has been operating for over 10 years, and in the past 6 hours we've arrested 17 people connected to fraud, money laundering, extortion, and kidnapping operations across 4 states. The room erupted in controlled celebration. Agents who had been working this case for months were finally seeing the results of their efforts. But, Murphy continued, we're not done yet. In 30 minutes, Vera Morrison is going to walk into that board meeting and deliver the final blow to Diana Sterling's criminal empire, because Diana still doesn't know that we've dismantled her entire operation. She thinks she's still in control. Murphy turned to me. Are you ready to finish this? I thought about everything Diana had put me through. The threats, the attempted frame-up the plan to kill me, and the fake kidnapping of my sister. I thought about all the other victims over the past decade who hadn't been as fortunate as I'd been. The employees who'd lost their jobs, the companies that had been financially damaged, and the 3 people who had died trying to expose similar schemes. I'm ready, I said. Let's end this. As we prepared to leave for TechFlow's headquarters, Murphy handed me a thick folder containing every piece of evidence the FBI had gathered about Diana's operation. Financial records, recorded conversations, surveillance photos, witness statements, and federal warrants for the arrest of everyone involved. When you walk into that board meeting, Murphy said, you won't just be representing yourself anymore. You'll be representing every victim of this criminal network, and you'll be carrying the full authority of the United States federal government. The ride to TechFlow felt like the calm before a storm. In 20 minutes, Diana Sterling was going to discover that her decade-long criminal career was over. She'd spent the day thinking she was manipulating a frightened employee into taking the blame for her crimes. Instead, she was about to face a federal witness, a major shareholder, and the complete destruction of everything she'd built through lies, theft, and violence. The reckoning was about to begin. The TechFlow Solutions boardroom had never felt more imposing than it did when I walked through those glass doors at exactly 4 o'clock. The same mahogany table where Diana had humiliated me 8 hours earlier now served as the stage for her downfall. All 12 board members were present, along with Diana herself, who sat at the head of the table with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. Behind me walked Agent Murphy, 2 additional FBI agents, and Patricia Stone, the federal prosecutor, who would be handling Diana's case. Tom Bradley, my mentor and the retiring CFO, sat at his usual spot, but gave me an almost imperceptible nod of support. Diana's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion as she realized I wasn't arriving alone or appearing defeated. Miss Morrison, said Board Chairman William Harper, a distinguished man in his 70s who'd known my grandfather personally. You called this emergency meeting. Please explain the circumstances that require our immediate attention. I placed the FBI evidence folder on the table and looked directly at Diana. For the past 3 months, I've been investigating systematic fraud within our company. What I discovered was a criminal enterprise that has stolen over $2.3 million from TechFlow Solutions and an estimated $12 million from multiple companies across the past decade. Diana stood up abruptly. This is exactly what I warned you about this morning. Miss Morrison has been embezzling money from the company and is now trying to deflect blame onto me to cover her crimes. Sit down, Ms. Sterling, Agent Murphy said, showing her badge. You're about to be formally charged with multiple federal crimes. The boardroom erupted in confused murmurs. Board members looked back and forth between Diana and me, trying to process what they were witnessing. There's been some kind of misunderstanding. Board member Robert Kane interjected, his face pale. Diana Sterling has impeccable credentials and excellent references from her previous positions. Mr. Kane, I said, opening the evidence folder, your statements would carry more weight if you weren't an active participant in the fraud scheme. I pulled out transcripts of recorded phone conversations between Kane and Diana, discussing how to structure fraudulent budget amendments to avoid triggering audit protocols. Kane's face went white as he read his own words detailing how to manipulate the board approval process. These conversations never happened, Kane protested weakly. Agent Murphy activated a small speaker and played a 30-second audio clip of Kane's voice, clearly discussing payment schedules for fake vendor contracts. The silence in the room was deafening. This is impossible, Diana said, her composure finally cracking. You're a data analyst. You don't have the authority or resources to conduct this kind of investigation. That's when I delivered the revelation that I'd been saving for this moment. Actually, I do have the authority, and I do have the resources. I pulled out legal documents that Patricia Stone had prepared that afternoon. 3 weeks ago, on my 28th birthday, I inherited 15% ownership of TechFlow Solutions through a trust fund established by my grandfather, Frank Morrison, the founder of this company. The boardroom fell completely silent. Even Board Chairman Harper looked stunned. As a 15% shareholder, I continued, I have the legal right to call emergency meetings, demand comprehensive financial audits, and access all corporate records. I also have the right to pursue legal action against anyone who has defrauded this company. Diana's face had gone ashen. That's not possible. We researched all major shareholders before I accepted this position. The trust fund was structured to remain confidential until activation, Patricia Stone explained. Miss Morrison's inheritance was never public record until she reached the age specified in her grandfather's will. I opened another section of the evidence folder, revealing bank statements, wire transfer records, and shell company documents that the FBI had obtained through federal warrants. Diana Sterling, along with accomplices Jake Harrison, Linda Walsh, and Robert Kane, created 17 fake vendors over the past 4 months. I announced to the board. They used these entities to submit fraudulent invoices for services, never rendered software licenses, never delivered, and consulting work never performed. The stolen money was laundered through a network of shell companies operating in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Board Chairman Harper examined the documents with growing horror. The amounts here total over $2 million. $2.3 million from TechFlow specifically, Agent Murphy corrected. But this criminal network has been operating for over 10 years. Our investigation has identified similar schemes at CloudSync Technologies, Data Flow Systems, Process Pro, and 14 other companies. The total theft exceeds $12 million. Diana made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Even if these allegations were true, which they're not, you can't prove I personally authorized any fraudulent transactions. I pulled out my laptop and connected it to the boardroom's presentation system. Actually, I can. The screen filled with recordings of Diana's voice explicitly discussing how to structure fake vendor payments to avoid detection. Email chains where she coordinated with accomplices about money laundering procedures. Video surveillance of her meeting with representatives from shell companies at locations throughout Ohio. These recordings were obtained legally through federal wiretaps authorized by court warrant, Agent Murphy explained. Miss Morrison has been cooperating with an FBI investigation for the past 6 weeks, but the most damning evidence was yet to come. I played the audio recording from Diana's attempted kidnapping arrangement earlier that day. Diana's voice filled the boardroom. Your sister's disappearance will become permanent. And trust me, Miss Morrison, when someone disappears in my network, they're never found. The board members stared at Diana in horror. Board member Sarah Chen spoke first. Did you just threaten to murder this woman's family member? That conversation was taken out of context, Diana said desperately. Agent Murphy stepped forward with federal arrest warrants. Diana Sterling, you're under arrest for racketeering, money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder and kidnapping. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs clicked around Diana's wrists, she looked at me with pure hatred. You have no idea what you've done. This network has connections you can't imagine. People in government, law enforcement, corporate security, they'll come after you. They already tried, I replied calmly. The man you hired to kill me was an undercover FBI agent. The team you sent to kidnap my sister arrested themselves when they walked into a federal sting operation. Your entire network has been dismantled in the past 24 hours. Diana's face crumpled as she realized the scope of her defeat. Everything she'd built over a decade of criminal activity had been destroyed in a single day. The woman you thought was my sister in that warehouse video was FBI agent Jessica Chen, I continued. She's been gathering evidence about your kidnapping operations for 2 months. Every person you trusted was either a federal agent or an informant working with law enforcement. As FBI agents escorted Diana from the boardroom, Board Chairman Harper addressed the remaining board members. I move for the immediate termination of Diana Sterling's employment and the initiation of a comprehensive audit of all financial transactions from the past year. All in favor? The vote was unanimous. I also move to offer Miss Morrison the position of Chief Technology Officer with the full authority to implement whatever security measures she deems necessary to prevent future fraud. Another unanimous vote. As the meeting concluded and board members filed out in stunned silence, Tom Bradley approached me with tears in his eyes. Your grandfather would be proud, he said simply. You saved the company he built. Looking around the boardroom where my career at TechFlow had nearly ended that morning, I realized that justice had indeed been served. Diana Sterling and her accomplices would face decades in federal prison. The money stolen from TechFlow and other companies would be recovered and returned. Most importantly, the criminal network that had operated with impunity for over 10 years had been completely destroyed. But the real victory wasn't the arrests or the recovered funds. It was the knowledge that future employees wouldn't have to face the threats, intimidation, and violence that Diana's network had used to silence whistleblowers. The tables had turned completely, and now it was time to build something better from the ruins of Diana's criminal empire. 3 months later, I sat in the witness chair of Federal District Court, facing the jury that would decide Diana Sterling's fate. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case, but this was my opportunity to tell the complete story of how a criminal network had operated with impunity for over a decade. Diana sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her confident demeanor from that board meeting replaced by the hollow stare of someone who knew her life was effectively over. Next to her, Jake Harrison, Linda Walsh, and Robert Kane waited their turn for individual trials, each facing their own decades in federal prison. Miss Morrison, Prosecutor Patricia Stone began, "Please tell the jury how this investigation began." I looked at the 12 faces in the jury box, ordinary people who would decide whether justice would truly be served. It started with numbers that didn't make sense. As a data analyst, I lived in spreadsheets and budget reports. When I saw purchase orders for $75,000 going to companies that didn't seem to exist, I knew something was wrong. Over the next 2 hours, I walked the jury through every step of the investigation. The discovery of fake vendors, the realization that Diana had accomplices inside TechFlow, the decision to contact the FBI when I understood the interstate nature of the crimes. "At what point did you realize your life was in danger?" Stone asked. "When I discovered that Diana had been monitoring my computer activity and planting false evidence to frame me for her crimes. That's when I understood this wasn't just about money anymore. She saw me as a personal threat that needed to be eliminated." The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man named David Walsh, tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee who had fabricated evidence to frame an innocent woman. But his strategy fell apart when Stone played the recordings of Diana explicitly discussing murder and kidnapping. "The defendant's own words prove her guilt beyond any reasonable doubt," Stone told the jury during closing arguments. This was not a moment of poor judgment or a single criminal act. This was a decade-long criminal enterprise that destroyed lives, bankrupted companies, and murdered at least 3 innocent people who tried to expose the truth. The trial lasted 2 weeks. During that time, FBI agents testified about the scope of the investigation. Financial experts explained how the money laundering operation worked. Victims from other companies described how the network had destroyed their careers and their lives. The most powerful testimony came from Agent Jessica Chen, the undercover agent who had posed as my kidnapped sister. "For 2 months, I lived inside this criminal organization," she told the jury. "I witnessed planning sessions for multiple murders. I heard Diana Sterling personally authorize the elimination of witnesses. This was not white-collar crime. This was organized violence disguised as corporate fraud." When the jury returned after 6 hours of deliberation, their verdict was swift and unanimous on all counts. Diana Sterling was found guilty of racketeering, money laundering, wire fraud conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and violation of federal organized crime statutes. At sentencing 2 months later, Federal Judge Margaret Thompson delivered a statement that brought tears to my eyes. "Miss Sterling, your criminal enterprise operated for over 10 years and caused immeasurable damage to innocent people and legitimate businesses. You've stolen not just money, but livelihoods, careers, and in at least 3 cases, human lives. The evidence presented at trial shows a pattern of escalating violence against anyone who threatened to expose your operation." Judge Thompson looked directly at Diana before continuing. "However, your greatest mistake was targeting Miss Morrison and her family. Because Miss Morrison's courage in coming forward has allowed law enforcement to dismantle an entire criminal network and prevent future victims from suffering the same fate as Rachel Martinez, David Kim, and Jennifer Walsh." The sentence was life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Jake Harrison received 25 years. Linda Walsh received 15 years for cooperation with the investigation. Robert Kane received 30 years and forfeiture of all assets obtained through criminal activity. But the most satisfying moment came after the sentencing, when Agent Murphy shared the final results of the investigation. "We recovered $11.8 million in stolen funds," she told me as we stood outside the courthouse. "Every company that was victimized will receive full restitution. More importantly, we prevented an estimated $50 million in future thefts by shutting down this network before they could target additional victims." The ripple effects extended far beyond financial recovery. The FBI's investigation led to arrests of corrupt executives at 12 other companies. Corporate security procedures were strengthened across the technology sector. New federal legislation was passed requiring enhanced monitoring of vendor payments and executive communications. My role at TechFlow had evolved beyond anything I could have imagined. As Chief Technology Officer and 15% owner, I'd implemented comprehensive fraud detection systems that became the industry standard. The company's stock price had reached record highs as investors appreciated our commitment to ethical business practices. But the most meaningful change was personal. I'd established the Frank Morrison Foundation for Corporate Ethics, named after my grandfather, which provided financial support and legal assistance to employees who witnessed fraud or corruption in their workplaces. The foundation had already helped 17 whistleblowers expose criminal activity at various companies. 6 months after Diana's sentencing, I received a letter that reminded me why the fight had been worth it. It came from a data analyst at a company in Seattle who had noticed irregular financial patterns similar to what I discovered at TechFlow. "Miss Morrison," the letter began, "I read about your case in the news and it gave me the courage to come forward about fraud at my company. Because of your example, I contacted the FBI instead of trying to handle it alone. The investigation has uncovered a $3 million embezzlement scheme, and my family is safe because I learned from your experience about the importance of federal protection for whistleblowers." That letter was worth more than any promotion or financial reward could ever be. Diana Sterling's criminal network had been dismantled, but more importantly, her tactics would never work the same way again. Future whistleblowers would know they weren't alone, and future criminals would know that someone was always watching. Justice hadn't just been served in Diana's case. It had been strengthened for everyone who would face similar situations in the future. The ripple effects of courage, I learned, can last far longer than the ripple effects of crime. Standing in my corner office at TechFlow, looking out at the city where my grandfather had started this company 57 years earlier, I realized that some legacies are worth fighting for. And sometimes the best way to honor the past is to build a better future. Diana Sterling had taught me that criminals count on good people staying silent. But she'd also learned too late that silence has its limits. And when good people finally speak up, they speak with the full force of justice behind them. 1 year later, I stood at the podium of the largest technology conference in the country, addressing an audience of 3,000 executives, analysts, and entrepreneurs. The invitation to give the keynote speech at TechForward 2026 was both an honor and an opportunity to share the lessons I'd learned from the most challenging year of my life. 12 months ago, I began looking out at the sea of faces. I was a senior data analyst who discovered some irregular numbers in quarterly reports. Today, I'm the Chief Technology Officer of a company that has become the industry standard for ethical business practices. The journey between those 2 points taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to do what's right even when you're terrified of the consequences. The story I told that day had been covered extensively in business publications, law enforcement journals, and ethics textbooks. But speaking directly to an audience of professionals who faced similar challenges every day felt different. These were people who might someday find themselves in situations where they had to choose between personal safety and moral responsibility. The Diana Sterling case wasn't just about catching one criminal, I continued. It was about understanding that corruption thrives when good people convince themselves that speaking up won't make a difference. Every person who stays silent because they think they're just one voice against a powerful system is exactly why systems like Diana's can operate for decades. In the audience, I spotted familiar faces. Agent Murphy sat in the third row, now promoted to head the FBI's new Corporate Crime Task Force. Tom Bradley, enjoying his retirement, had flown in from Florida to hear my speech. Even some of the jurors from Diana's trial had come to see how the story ended. But the face that mattered most was in the front row. Emma, my sister now in her final semester at Ohio State, had chosen to write her senior psychology thesis about the psychological impact of whistleblowing on families. The fake kidnapping that Diana had arranged had actually brought Emma and me closer together, helping her understand the importance of standing up for justice even when it comes at personal cost. The most important lesson I learned, I told the audience, is that justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create together. Every person who sees wrongdoing and chooses to document it instead of ignoring it. Every person who supports a colleague who's trying to do the right thing. every person who refuses to be intimidated by those who use power to silence truth. After my speech, the questions from the audience revealed how widespread these issues really were. A software engineer from Portland described discovering security vulnerabilities that his company was hiding from customers. An accountant from Dallas talked about pressure from executives to manipulate earnings reports. A procurement manager from Denver asked for advice about suspected kickback schemes. Each story reminded me that Diana Sterling's network hadn't been unique. It had been part of a broader culture where financial success was often valued more highly than ethical behavior. But each person asking for advice also represented hope that culture was changing. The Frank Morrison Foundation for Corporate Ethics had grown beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. We now had partnerships with law enforcement agencies in 12 states, providing both financial support and legal protection for employees who reported criminal activity. Our success rate was remarkable. 87% of cases we supported resulted in successful prosecutions and full financial recovery. But success wasn't just measured in arrests and recovered money. It was measured in the companies that had strengthened their ethical standards after learning about our work. The executives who had chosen transparency over cover-ups. The employees who had found the courage to speak up because they knew they wouldn't face retaliation alone. TechFlow Solutions had become a case study in how companies could recover from criminal infiltration and emerge stronger than before. Our revenue had increased by 40% over the past year, largely because customers trusted our commitment to ethical business practices. Our employee satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry because people knew they worked for a company that valued integrity over profit. Most importantly, we'd created a culture where questioning suspicious activities was seen as professional responsibility rather than disloyalty. The fraud detection systems I'd implemented weren't just about catching criminals. They were about creating transparency that made criminal activity impossible in the first place. Diana Sterling herself had become a cautionary tale, studied in business schools and law enforcement academies. Her life sentence had sent a clear message that white-collar crime would be prosecuted with the same severity as any other form of organized criminal activity. The other members of her network were serving sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years, ensuring that this particular criminal enterprise would never reconstitute itself. But the real victory was in the ripple effects. The legislation passed in response to our case had strengthened reporting requirements and protection for whistleblowers across multiple industries. The FBI's Corporate Crime Task Force had prevented an estimated $200 million in fraud over the past year by applying the investigative techniques developed during our case. As I concluded my speech that day, I shared the personal lesson that meant the most to me. People often ask me if I regret getting involved in this investigation. They point out that I could have been killed, that my family was threatened, that my career was nearly destroyed. But here's what I learned. The only thing worse than facing powerful people who try to silence you is living with the knowledge that you stayed silent when you could have prevented others from being hurt. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but more important than applause were the conversations that happened afterward. Business cards exchanged between potential whistleblowers and supportive colleagues, contact information shared with the Frank Morrison Foundation, plans made for stronger ethical oversight at companies across the country. Walking back to my hotel that evening, I thought about my grandfather Frank and the company he'd built with the belief that business could be both profitable and principled. Diana Sterling had tried to corrupt that legacy, but in the end, she'd only made it stronger. My phone buzzed with the text message from Agent Murphy. Saw your speech online. Proud of how far you've come. By the way, we just arrested another network using similar tactics in Chicago. Your case is still saving lives. That night, as I reviewed emails from conference attendees asking for advice about their own ethical dilemmas, I realized that the most important part of my story wasn't the dramatic confrontation or the satisfying courtroom victory. It was the quiet decision I'd made months earlier to document irregular numbers instead of ignoring them. Justice, I'd learned, starts with small choices made by ordinary people who decide that right matters more than easy. It grows when those people find the courage to act despite their fears. And it succeeds when enough people decide that protecting each other is more important than protecting themselves. Diana Sterling had taught me that silence in the face of wrongdoing is a choice. But she'd also taught me that speaking up is a choice too. And when enough people choose to speak, even the most powerful criminals discover that their power has limits. The best part of my story wasn't that justice was served. It was that justice was strengthened for everyone who would face similar choices in the future. And that's a legacy worth fighting for. Have you ever witnessed something at work that didn't seem right but stayed quiet because you weren't sure if speaking up would make a difference? The truth is, your voice matters more than you know, and there are people ready to support you when you find the courage to use it. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more stories about standing up for what's right, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and let me know in the comments about a time when you chose courage over comfort. Remember, justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create together, one brave decision at a time. Thank you for listening, and may you always have the strength to choose what's right over what's easy.